Well, hello, everybody. Today we're going to do chapter 2 of Speaker's Meaning by Owen Barfield. And I'm here again with Michael, who is my Barfield cultural informant. Good to have you, Michael.
Good to see you.
I have an upfront question about this that someone more or less asked me the other day. And I thought, yeah, I don't know the answer to that. Why does it matter? Why does all this Barfield stuff matter? I mean, it's very, very difficult, right? So deep. I don't mind admitting I had to read this chapter twice and listen to you read it once before it finally started to sink in what he was getting at.
Why does it matter? Well, I think it matters. I don't know that there's anything more fundamental to what it means to be human than language. I mean, in terms of meaning, in terms of understanding, in terms of just practical, shaping and direction of one's life. And I think it's hard to get more fundamental or dig deeper than language, I think. So I think from that perspective, it is deep down in the weeds, but I don't think you can understand a lot of other topics, including, history, science, all these other things. They're all built on top of language. And so I think language often becomes a part of our mental toolbox in very implicit ways. And so we don't necessarily recognize or understand the ways in which it's doing a lot of the heavy lifting for us in terms of thinking. And also the idea that a lot of that thinking wasn't done by us. It was done by people that long preceded us. And we are both the beneficiaries of that work, but we also whatever side effects or byproducts of any mistakes they made, we're also bequeathed those as well. So it might be something to dig into or be aware of.
Well, and as you were talking, what came to my mind was the whole Newspeak thing from George Orwell. I mean, the way that they limited the revolution in the people was to severely restrict the language that was available to them to use to think. If you don't have language to think with, you can't think. And so if the language gets simplified down to the point where it no longer has any meaning, then it's very difficult for people to think their way through problems. So
yeah. And if you go back and think about the Inklings too, and if you think like I do, that Barfield had a very seminal influence on that group, I think language was where he had the biggest impact. You can see later books that C.S. Lewis writes that are dedicated to Barfield. He actually wrote a book on language called, it kind of parallels some of Barfield's history in English words. It's called Studies in Words. Very interesting book. I read it like 10, 15 years ago, but it was a very fascinating word study of different, because he goes a lot deeper. I mean, I'd say Barfield kind of tries to draw these very long historical kind of trajectories, whereas Lewis goes very deep in terms of like the ways in which a specific word was used in like ancient English texts and so forth, and how it changes over time. He does a much more careful analysis of each word that he picks up and looks at. And then also Tolkien is very, very influenced by this idea of language as a sort of fundamental building block of a world. And he often would say things like, he'd be in his class trying to teach something and want to say something that was in vogue with the philologist of his time, and realize like that things that Barfield had taught him meant that was absolutely not true. And so this second chapter kind of goes into some of that, because Barfield's talking about how certain things, certain theories about how language developed have these sort of like just they imply or they assume certain things without any sort of real evidence for them. They just kind of like think, okay, well, there was this quote unquote metaphorical period in history where language suddenly developed this richness. And he says, we don't really have any evidence for that.
Yeah, which we'll get into when we get into the chapter. But before we do that, another thing that came to my mind was that when I first became a Christian in 1980, and I don't know how I got onto this, but somehow I bought a copy of Noah Webster's first dictionary, which is like 1756 or something like that. I don't remember what year it was. And man, was that eye-opening to see how much language has changed in our country in just those 260 years. I mean, just really eye-opening.
Yeah.
And and it really makes the reading of the King James Bible so much richer, because you're still 100 years out from when the King James was translated, but much closer to that in time than we are now.
Yeah. How did you come across that book?
It had been published anew. Somebody had, I suppose maybe it was some Christian organization that I was involved in or something that said, you got to have this. And so
nice.
I bought I don't have it anymore, because when we moved to Japan, we left everything
Too heavy
behind, and it somehow wasn't there when I got back. So like a lot of other things. So yeah, so talking about this chapter, he starts out with this idea of two different ways in which language can change due to the proportionality of what's speaker's meaning and what's lexical meaning. And those two ways are contraction and expansion. Mm-hmm. Would you like to describe those?
Yeah. So contraction is, as you might think, it's just a word coming to mean less than it had meant previously. And some of that would become about by just sort of laziness, or it becomes completely associated to a particular phenomenon. And so the other utilizations of the word just kind of die out. And then the other way would be expansion. And the expansion
let's just stick with contraction for a second and give some examples. So one of the examples he gave was furniture. Mm-hmm. And you have to think about that for a minute, but I do recollect reading old English novels and stuff where they talked about the furniture of a person's apparel. Basically anything with which you were furnished. It could be your clothing, your boots, your luggage, all of that stuff used to be called furniture. And now furniture is just the, tables and chairs in your living room. So
mm-hmm. Yeah. It just gets so used in a particular sense that it just kind of blocks out the view of all the other ones. Is kind of how I think about it. And I think that's definitely happening, because I mean, words, in a certain sense, words are dying all the time, and so even if they are staying alive, oftentimes they stay alive, and just one little facet of it is what survives, and everything else kind of falls to the wayside. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so expansion.
Expansion is the idea of people and really the expansion kind of, I think, links very closely to his idea of the evolution of consciousness, in that as we are exploring new territory, we're coming across concepts, ideas, scientific discoveries. Those are two of the examples he uses, are actual scientific discoveries with gravity and focus. But we're finding new things that there isn't a word to describe what phenomenon there is that we're seeing or have pictured. Therefore, we're kind of forced to kind of just take what's on the shelf and what's closest within the bucket of words we have available to us, and then try and assign it this new meaning, and try and hopeful that kind of takes on shape of how people can understand and use the word. And he makes a pretty powerful claim in the book that he's quoting some other author, but I think this is kind of fundamental to Barfield's thinking as well, that he basically makes the point that if there were in place the sort of kind of precise and analytical approach to language that we're tending towards today was in place during Newton's time, that this idea of gravity couldn't have been successfully communicated. It was so integral to the communication of that concept, that gravity, this word that had not had any sort of implementation from a more scientific perspective could somehow take on this new meaning, which today is almost, well, I guess sometimes you will use the word gravity in a more metaphorical way, but most of the time it's pointing specifically to this new scientific concept. And he says
they had the scientific concept with Newton, but as I understand it from the book here, it was restricted just to something falling towards Earth, right? The way Newton used gravity was just to talk about something falling towards Earth. But then when Einstein used it, he started to use it meaning going out all into the outer reaches of space beyond the moon. And
well, no, Newton understood that as well, because I mean, he was seeing those forces influencing how the moon moved around the Earth and how we moved around the sun.
But out beyond our solar system. I mean, I'm not saying this. This is what this guy said.
Okay. Oh, which quote are you reading?
Where does he talk about gravity? Yeah, here he says on page 28, he says, oh no, that's when he talks about them as being metaphors. Well, I mean, it's a quibble. It doesn't really matter. Oh, down to at the very first page of the chapter 2, it's down to the 17th or 18th century, gravity in its physical sense was virtually a synonym for heaviness or weight, the quality which leads solid objects to seek the center of the earth. Whereas, since Newton's time, I got it. Okay, both words have come to mean, when normally used by normal people, a force or law operating not only in the sublunary sphere, but throughout the wide spaces of the universe. Okay, so starting with Newton, that's when this began to change. But then Einstein used it even more broadly.
Right, as a feature of something that I think still we don't internalize very well, this concept of space-time, which is very weird to try and fit into your head. And then even people struggle to do that now. And now the quantum world seems to kind of make that somewhat obsolete. But the point he's trying to make here is that we have a very difficult time understanding the sort of difficulty they had in making these movements, right? Because we, and he uses an example, is like, if we want to understand how difficult it was for them to make this movement, to say gravity is something that just has to do with a relationship to the earth, and to think about it like out there in space as the force that moves the bodies in the heavens. If we want to understand how difficult it was for them to make that assumption, we should try to think about thought in the way they thought about it, which was something that was applicable to sort of the universe as a whole. Like that thinking was something that extended out into these sort of spheres of the angelic and all these different kind of levels that now today, when we use the word thinking, we almost without exception, a modern person thinks about a brain of some kind as a necessary component of thought, which was completely different from how they saw those things. So like he said, well, if you want to understand how hard it is for them to make this shift in understanding this word, try and think about thought as the way they thought about it, and you'll understand the difficulty that they were facing.
So yeah, I wondered what that was. I put in the margins, I put, well, what was the old way of thinking about thought? So you looked it up, or you just know that from your
it's kind
background?
Well, it's built into the Aristotelian kind of model of the universe, where he even sees like this idea of like, he even sees like love as this sort of thing that's causing the celestial spheres to move around each other in this perpetual motion. Like there's something like, and there's a sort of cosmic intelligence at work everywhere that is directing things in this sort of like quote unquote perfect way, like towards everything is like tending towards the actualization of its like whatever this built-in potential of it is.
Mm-hmm.
That again, which is just completely alien to us. It just sounds weird. It just sounds like you're projecting something into the world that isn't really there.
Well, it makes perfect sense to me, but that's because I don't have a science degree.
Yeah. And what's funny though, I was thinking about this the other day. I can see why stripping away that Aristotelian view allowed us to uncover a lot, because in a certain sense, that Aristotelian view had become a sort of, originally it was an icon of sorts for exploring the world, but it had kind of bumped up against, as Barfield points out in the book, right? He says for Newton in his day, the Aristotelian model of the universe was just implicitly built into all the assumptions of their words, right? It was just kind of like, it's what the words meant. You didn't have, and which is both good and bad, right? It means I don't have to do any work in conveying something to you. It's built into the word itself, right? When I say it, we all know we're on the same page, because that implicit meaning is just so present within the culture and the way in which the word is continuously used. And he makes the point that a lot of our modern words have 19th century positivism or built into them. But one of the things I realized is that this Aristotelian model, to some degree, had become kind of an idol of sorts, right? And I was thinking this because I was listening to like some science guy talk about, he was just going on and on about like, how things don't have any purpose, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, it was irritating me. So I was like trying to think like, why does he think that way? And I realize one of the things you do when you assume this sort of randomness rather than purpose, it does allow you to see things that you wouldn't otherwise see. It's kind of like what we were talking about in our last conversation about the negative space. You kind of like wipes the chalkboard of anything, and you're saying like, oh, when you say there's no purpose, like it prevents you from drawing lines about what you think should be there. And allows you to say, oh, it's just random. And so then you have to be much more careful in terms of empirical observation about what is actually there. And you can see how that has had, a real dramatic impact on our ability to scientifically observe the world and make progress. Because it opened up this whole new space that people couldn't see previous to that.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I can see that.
Sorry, that was a huge digression.
No, it just made me think about this video I was watching this morning about the power of symmetry. And there were four physicists talking about symmetry and supersymmetry and how symmetry operates in the universe. And they were giving lots of examples, using organic examples, inorganic examples, all the way down to the quantum level examples of symmetry. And just so many interesting things that they said in there that relates to what we're talking about right now, but I didn't have time to timestamp it so I could show bits and pieces of it. So maybe we'll have to do that another time. But many of them were saying these things like that, like, well, that's just accidental, or that's just, there's no purpose in that. And in a way, it does help them define things, but in another way, it sort of stops them, because they're even talking about different leaps that have come along in physics over the centuries. And part of what prevented that leap from happening was some presumption that they already had in mind that was holding them back. And some of it, that used to be presumptions that were the old model, but now the presumptions are something about some new model that's come up in the last 50 years. And that presumption is keeping them from seeing something that really looks more like the old model, So
yeah,
all of those
it's
things,
like,
we need to clean the windshield and just pursue truth where it leads us without putting roadblocks in the way.
yeah, I totally agree. And I do think, the idea that a scientist can wake up in the morning and just look at the world objectively with no sort of biases or preconceptions that inform where they look and why is nonsense, right? You have to, and all those things are tools, but they're also things that get in the way. And so you're absolutely right that like where that negative space was that, that they could look at by taking away the Aristotelian model, that's all to a large degree, it's very filled in with other new models. And those models can be icons that help you look into the world in new ways. But at some point, it seems like they always fall down, especially these scientific models. And so it does seem like the most radical thing you can do nowadays is assume that there is purpose in the world, and that there is a sort of cosmic intelligence, and have that inform your opinions about how you investigate things. Which, again, this is another strange prediction Barfield makes, is that at some point, and I think he makes the prediction, this would be sometime in the 21st century, that we would come across a place where we couldn't do science anymore until we explicitly made reference to the word being incarnated. So this idea of the logos being integral to us being able to move forward. And when I think of the logos, one of the things I think of is this sort of invisible property of things that allows it to hold together, that gives it a wholeness, that allows us to say this is one thing and not a million things. To say like, and that, so, we were talking a lot in our last video about like these cells, and like, there's something in a cell that causes it all to work in concert together, right? So there's a sort of logos of that cell, and it's invisible. Like you can't find it. It doesn't exist in the DNA. Like people want to boil down, well, the DNA by itself is useless. It's this whole holistic of these parts together that is invisible, but is all acting in accordance with something. And I do think there's something there that at some point, I think even if you wanted to continue to be a materialistic scientist, right, and just be like, there is no God, there is no purpose, etc., to come up with rational explanations for this sort of complexity we see specifically with life, and this rapid, evolution over time of complexity, you're gonna have to point to something. Like you call it the life principle, or you come up with some scientific long Latin name for it or something, but that's something is pushing things along that has to be there for this complexity to come into existence, I would think.
Well, especially think about the inside of a cell, which the way that it organizes itself inside is there's electrical communication going on, between the parts. So, and then within a larger structure, there's electrical communication going on between the cells. So where's that communication coming from? I mean, if you had when they first came up with telegraphy, nobody would have thought that those signals with information in them were just randomly crossing the country.
Mm-hmm.
There's got to be some wires. There's got to be somebody tapping it in at the other end. It's but we take a lot for granted when we look at information. One of the things they were talking about on this video that I was watching is the symmetry of a beehive with their honeycomb, and talking about usually living things are constructed in order to minimize the use of energy. And so the honeycomb is a perfect structure to minimize energy because it's a hexagon. But he was talking about how the hexagons all fit together perfectly, and so there's only 3 structures that can fit together perfectly like that: squares, triangles, and hexagons. And everything else would leave gaps, and gaps would allow for bacteria to get in there. Gaps would mean that there could be less honey stored. And it turns out that hexagon is also the smallest perimeter of anything, so that it uses less wax than if they did squares or triangles. Right. And then he uses the language, he says, so they decided to use hexagon. And he's completely straight-faced. I don't think he understands what kind of language he's using,
This is like the Brett Weinstein, we're just robots, but we gotta realize we're robots and change our programming. It's like, well, if you're robots, you are just the programming. We don't really have access to it's a weird thing that people do. It's like I don't know what you call it. It's similar to that phenomenon of Jesus smuggling, but it's something else. It's like once you've determined to say purpose doesn't exist, you have to at some point smuggle purpose back in some way.
Well, the language inhibits us, right? The language is filled with purpose words. You'd have to invent a new language that doesn't have the use of purpose in it and find some way to still convey the ideas without all those purpose words that are built into the language. And so, well, let's not get too far astray. We'll never get through chapter 2. So when he's talking about the expansion, and he said sometimes it takes more than one speaker to bring a change about, which seems pretty obvious to me. He makes this statement on page 25. I just want to read this because I thought this was really interesting. He's talking about a quote from an American psychologist named J.M. Baldwin. I'll just read the paragraph. It's not very long. The development of thought is by a method essentially of experimentation, of the use of meanings as worth more than they are as yet recognized to be worth. The individual must use his own thoughts, his established knowledges, his grounded judgments for the embodiment of his new inventive constructions. And here's a sentence I thought was really interesting. He erects his thought, as we say, schematically, projecting into the world an opinion still peculiar to himself as if it were true. Thus, all discovery proceeds. The language he used there sounds so much like what I've been trying in the past to explain to you the way I see the meaning of hope, as projecting something schematically out into the world as if it were true. And so I thought that the way he described that was very similar to this idea of hope that I've been thinking about. But it's also very similar to art, because I think art works that way too, because an artist projects out into the world something that is peculiar to himself, but as if it were true. And then other people can look at it and decide whether or not that's going to resonate with them, right? Mm-hmm. And so that seemed to me that this whole development of thought is maybe that progression works through all the layers of everything.
Yeah. What in your idea, when you say hope schematically pushes in the future, I mean, I'm curious how that relates to you. Does that have some connection to the logos for you in terms of
it does, because the verse that creates that picture in my mind, and I'm very apprehensive about the picture because it sounds a little bit like the new age thing of if you can think it, you can have it, right? Or the life coaches that are always telling you to imagine your future and then it will happen. But to me, it's more of it's a framework that comes out of that verse that faith is the substance of things hoped for. Because the thing that you're hoping for is not yet a substance, right? But faith is what gives it substance.
Yeah.
I think that's what that verse means. Faith gives it substance. And so if you're thinking in terms of someone who is trying to take a new thought and project it into the world through the use of language in a new and novel way, the only language we have, using it in a new and novel way, isn't that what they're doing? They're projecting this idea out into the world, and it does not yet have substance, but they have to have the faith somehow that it can absorb or latch on to this substance, and that this substance will become a real thing. Otherwise, why would you even try?
Yeah. Well, I mean, when you're talking about all the new age stuff, right? I mean, I think where they get it wrong is to say, like, to think about it necessarily brings it to pass, right? But in some sense, they're right. They're probably right that there's some necessary precondition that you do imagine that something is possible or else you're not going to do any of the groundwork. You're not going to, like, what's the old saying? It's like, if you think you can, or if you think you can't, either way, you're right.
Yeah,
I mean,
and it's the whole thing about the 4-minute mile. Before the first
Yeah.
guy ran a 4-minute mile, nobody even imagined it was possible. But after he ran that 4-minute mile, now it's possible. Now it starts happening everywhere, right?
Yeah. If Luke is listening to this, I know he's going to start talking about morphic resonance. Have you heard
Well,
him
yeah,
talk about that?
that's in my margins too. Rupert Sheldrake.
Yeah. Which that's very interesting to me too, because part of what that points to is like it's sort of the difference between, in Barfield's evolution of consciousness, the evolution of consciousness just being sort of something happening psychological, or is there some ontological change in the world when you do something that breaks through some sort of barrier? Maybe, and supposedly, I use supposedly because these, I haven't really looked into it too deeply, but like Rupert Sheldrake said all these things, like where he says like, well, if you do an experiment over here with these group of mice, it seems to have effects on groups of mice that never had any interaction with them somehow. Like it's almost like something in the world has changed once this barrier has been broken through, which is interesting. I don't know. Like the skeptic in me immensely, immediately breaks in and goes, oh, that, well, how, I tend to disbelieve things rather than believe them. But I think, I don't know, like it seems like there has to be, just like as I was pointing before, there has to be these super sensible realities that we're interacting with.
Well, one thing that comes to my mind is that somewhere in my college career, I can't remember what class I was in. I have no idea. But the instructor was talking about something called the climate of opportunity. And that there arise times in the world's history when the climate of opportunity is there for certain ideas to arise. And then those ideas will arise even before there was mass communication around the planet. Those ideas would arise in 2 different locations on the planet at the same time. But you take somebody like Da Vinci, his ideas didn't go anywhere in the beginning because it wasn't the right climate of opportunity. The technology wasn't there to get his flying machines up in the air and right. All of that. But when the time is right, when the climate of opportunity is there, then these ideas will arise in various locations on the planet. Yeah. And
it's almost like you have to get a sort of critical mass, right?
Well, the ground has to be prepared for sure.
Yeah. And I think, and this is where, again, I'm even before Barfield, I had noticed this, that part of that critical mass is an evolution of language. And so, yeah, I've had this idea for like a website for a long time where I wanted to make it easier for people to kind of, the idea was based on like being able to tag certain ideas or content or like things so that you could have a kind of placeholder for a novel use of language, right? Where you could say, okay, I know most people when they use this word, they're meaning X, but I'm specifically trying to kind of create this new little slice of like, I'd like to use it in this more novel way, right? And give people ways, because you could think about it, like one of the ways you could track a lot of people's truly new ideas, like if something's really new, you end up having to use language in a novel way to even try and describe it, and that's always really difficult. And so if you could easily stumble across somebody else on the web or on the internet, that was trying to use this word or trying to point at something that you were trying to point at as well, and use an existing word in this way, if you could, kind of have a groundswell where you could help flesh that out for other people, that would be tremendously useful. But as is often the case, in the past, it feels like it always took what we would term today a genius. Of course, that word genius has changed its meaning a lot. Barfield goes into that. Genius used to mean something like a kind of sort of spiritual reality that was assigned to you at birth. And when you were expressing your genius, you were kind of listening to your sort of muse or something like that. Now we think of genius as like, I don't know, you have like a really high IQ, or like your brain is like, let's go back and look at, fragments of Einstein's brain under a microscope to see about what about the particular structure of his brain made him a quote unquote genius. But we had these geniuses that not only had to have a unique idea, they also to some extent had to be sort of, I guess the word would be disagreeable, or I would say very determined, or even if you look at the history of these guys' lives, oftentimes they were kind of just jerks. They kind of just were so intent on wanting to do the things they did. And that in some sense was a critical component of them being able to steward this new idea past all the boundaries it would face, till the point it could get to some sort of birthing process, whether that was some sort of scientifically, determined experiment that verified it, or whatever the case may be. Almost always the case, if you look back, and this is sometimes hard to do because we just think, oh yeah, everybody like Einstein, burst on the equation. He was just, lauded as a genius. No, people laugh at this stuff. Like there's really smart people that laugh at your ideas for a long time before they get implemented.
Sure. Because I've been doing all this stuff on entropy with Glenn, I've listened to a lot of stories about the beginnings of the whole field of thermodynamics. And Carnot was one of the early guys, and nobody listened to Carnot. Mm-hmm. He died when he was very young. He was in his 30s when he died. And when he died, he'd had no idea that his ideas were going to have any traction at all. And then Boltzmann comes along, and Boltzmann's ideas were so heretical to the system that they just ridiculed him and, made him into this ludicrous figure, to the point that he eventually committed suicide.
Yeah.
And then the year after he commits suicide, they're like, oh, wait, this is true. It revolutionizes the world, So, yeah, a lot of scientists act nowadays as though science is this very orderly process, and we're just going to keep experimenting and getting more and more data, and then we're going to have these new aha moments.
It's a complete fiction, yeah.
Prove something. It's never worked that way.
Yeah, the whatever the establishment is always worked against progress. It always has. If you look at history.
It just occurred to me, it's like the picture of evolution, right? Certainly microevolution takes place. Once you have a species, things are happening piece by piece along there. But it's like science. Once you have an idea, then you can take it, you can do experiments on it, you can try to verify it or falsify it and all that kind of stuff. You can do all these empirical steps. But until the next big aha moment comes along, you don't have a new thing to work on. And that's exactly like evolution. You have to, if you look at it on the macro scale, you have to have the species before you can start the little incremental improvements or changes or devolution or whatever takes place in a species.
Yeah, and it makes me think, when you were saying that, I don't know, when I remember when Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson were having their debates, and Jordan Peterson's just repeatedly trying to get Sam to see that there's some value in religion, and he kind of gets to a point in one of their conversations where he almost gets there, but then he goes, well, what's good in there is everything but the dogma. Like he's like the dogma is the thing that like just holds us back, and it makes me think like dogma in this scenario kind of is what I was just referring to in the establishment. You always need this sort of protective sort of resiliency to change that is able to steward and hold on to the status quo so that it can survive long enough to productively integrate the new stuff, right? So I kind of think of like dogma, which again, Sam was using in this negative connotation, is it's sort of like DNA. It's like, and you mostly want it to stay relatively, continuous through time. You don't want it, if changes occur, you want them to be relatively infrequent rather, and very carefully guarded against, right? Because most of them are going to be bad ideas. The amount of geniuses versus cranks on the internet is like, 1 to a billion maybe, or I don't know, something like that. Maybe not that high, but it's very, most ideas are bad ideas. And so you do want a strong resistance program to bad ideas. But at the same token, any creature, if they're going to progress, has to be put into strenuous environments, or else, Jordan Peterson makes this observation, like you even won't get certain parts of your DNA won't even turn on until you get put into those strenuous environments. And so like, I do think we've gotten into a phase where the establishment has gotten so powerful and so unmoved. It doesn't have to really evolve or integrate new information such that they are becoming really static. Nassim Taleb, he has a book. One of his more recent books is called Anti-Fragile, where he talks about, systems are actually improved by their encounters with destructive forces. Whether that's your body, like, that's why exercise works for your body. It's forces that are effectively breaking your body down and forcing it to rebuild the body, those protein structures, in a more adapted way to the destructive forces it was just encountered. And so I think, there's always this sort of dynamic between the need for tradition and trying to carry it forward, and then also avenues for kind of fertilizing the next generation of ideas to actually, not get squashed by an overbearing establishment.
They're using archetypal language. The way that you just said that, it almost sounded like the establishment is the overprotective mother, right? And then the revolutionary scientist would be the one that's navigating between order and chaos, going over into chaos and getting something to bring back and rejuvenate the order. Yeah. You're talking archetypally there, Michael.
Like the idea I had for like I called the meta tags, was the idea I was thinking there was like how much, it becomes really difficult. I think it's never been more difficult in certain respects for you to have a new idea and hold on to it long enough to make a real impact. And so the idea I had behind that was to help hopefully create a sort of placeholder for people to find other folks who were kind of on the same path, who were kind of going down the same path, so they could maybe contribute a missing piece or do something to provide someone with the encouragement to continue exploring something, even if, because, historically speaking, most of these guys, a lot of them were amateurs at what they were doing, and I was, I feel like it's weird because we have more information available to us than ever before, but we're in this sort of sea of complexity and, ADD and having our attention drift from this to this to this. So unless you're really persistent and focused on a certain thing, it's hard to get the ball down the field in any real respect. So even the slightest bit of encouragement you could find from somebody else or a sort of dialogue partner can be really beneficial when you're actually doing something really new, where you're actually having to try and use language in new ways and explore new ideas. It's difficult, and most people don't understand what you're talking about, and it's just frustrating. It's just, it's a continual exercise in failure and how much of it you can withstand usually, and most people can't withstand that much. So
I think you should do it.
Yeah.
And it could be, it could be a multivalent or multitasking website. You could have this one page where people can deposit these words and with a definition of where it's going or whatever. You could have another page that's looking at the devolution of language and how language is getting corrupted I mean, some words have been made to become almost meaningless now. They're used in such loose ways that especially political language. There's so much political
Yeah.
language that's
Yeah.
used differently by different people. And you might be saying something and thinking that they understand you, and they're understanding completely 180 degrees from where you are. So you could have another page that's doing that. Then you could have another section that would be like a kind of like Jonathan Pajot's Symbolic World website, where people submit articles where they're talking about things that they've noticed about the evolution of language, or ideas that they have about Barfield's work, or something like that. And then you could have a blog where you just talk about ideas that come up. And I think it'd be a great website, a great place for people to hang out. Could be a discussion like that.
Well,
Symbolic
I've thought
World
about it in
website.
some detail. Maybe on a future episode, I could lay it out in more concrete terms, and then
Don't
people
tell
could.
people what the name of it is until you've secured the website, though. Because
I don't know.
You can probably buy it for $10 right now. But if you start talking about
I'm
it,
not
somebody else
worried
is
about it. Again, I've thought for years. I've had this idea for like over 15 years, and I've always thought like somebody's going to build something like this. I'm like I'm every time I see like a certain thing that kind of is like it, I'm like, oh, this is going to be it. Somebody else, and I'm always just like shocked, because I'm like, this is, to me, it's just really obvious. But this is the thing you realize if you actually have an idea that's new, like it's very hard to get people. Like I could probably try and articulate it and nobody would get it. And so yeah, I would enjoy the opportunity just to try and articulate it and see what people thought of it, or if it even made sense to them at all. But because it is like most of my thinking, it's overly ambitious. So
well, but you just start somewhere.
yeah.
I don't think it has to be this big flash and pop thing to start with. It can just be a placeholder. And then you start adding to it as you go. I mean, there's this one woman whose blog I read almost every day and have for years. She is a law professor in Wisconsin. She's retired now, but when I first started reading her blog back in 2007, she was a law professor. She just has a very idiosyncratic mind on the kind of things that she blogs about, but she's blogged every day. But when she first started out, it was just this simple little thing, but now she gets millions of hits. And now when the New York Times does an article about something, sometimes they'll go to her blog and they'll say, this is what she said about it. Like, and when she started out, she's just an ordinary person putting down her thoughts and her ideas. And so sometimes it takes time. We're 14 years into this now, and now she's got a lot of traction.
Yeah. Well, I don't necessarily think I have interesting ideas, but I think
you do. Otherwise, why would I be talking to you?
But I think what's interesting about this site is the potential for other people to kind of pollinate and exchange ideas with one another. Yes, I think that's more interesting.
But even that takes time, because like you said, it takes time for people to begin to understand what it is that you're talking about. You're putting something out into the world. How did he put that? Projecting into the world an opinion still peculiar to yourself, as if it were true, and thus all discovery proceeds. That's how it happens. And so it has to start somewhere.
Well, I promise you, after we get through this Barfield's speakers meeting, we'll do an episode on that.
Okay.
I've thought about it in such great detail that it's kind of I could hopefully make it understandable or relatable, or at least you could help me see where I'm falling down in terms of communicating it.
Okay, so there's two more things I want to get to before we quit, and one is this whole thing about figurative language. Because he says at the end of the chapter, he says basically he's using a lot of inverted language, but basically what he's saying is that all language is or has been figurative, but language itself did not originate as metaphor. And so I'm trying to get my head wrapped around that.
Yeah, this is where Barfield is kind of a confusing writer. I actually underline that as well. I think what he's saying there is he's saying language couldn't have evolved, because this is kind of what philologists of his time that he's critical of are assuming, that there's this sort of metaphorical period. But specifically the comment there about, language can't originate as metaphor because you have to have language in place before metaphor can even come to be, right? So language, it's like a chicken and egg problem, right? You have to have the language in place before you can start playing with it in these sort of creative and imaginative ways that we associate with metaphor.
But it sounds like he's saying that language did originate as figurative.
Well, what he's saying is we don't have any historical examples, or even if we look at sort of, people that live in primal ways today that would probably be the best stewards of primal ways of thinking and living, we don't have examples of where people have a strictly quote unquote literal outer meaning of things. We see this, when we go back in time, we see a union between the inner and the outer. We don't have this speculated sort of like, literal outer meaning, which comes from the theories of philologists who are trying to think, well, if we assume, the evolutionary model is correct, and we had, these primates as our ancestors, and at some point, some of these primates became good with tools and, had other quirks. And so they started communicating with each other via grunts or something. And somehow, like, it's this, you have to try and break this down into different steps. And presumably those grunts are all like, pointing at things in the world, like, okay, this is the kind of grunt for a tree. This is the kind of grunt for, something else, some other tool they're using or whatever. And that somehow this gets elaborated over time into what we call language. But what he's saying is we should have more fossilized uses of words that we can pick up on that are just the outer. But he's saying, my only criticism of him would be like, yeah, well, maybe we obviously can't go very far back, and we can't go into prehistory too far. There is analysis of language that we can do to say, all right, these branches of words all came from a root language, and so that this must have been what the root language was. I'm not familiar enough with those techniques to know how they do that. But Barfield's History in English Words is built on a lot of that early philological research and work. But he's saying we can't find evidence of literal only meanings when we go back in time. Or if we look at
it, just like it's just a word for an object that doesn't have also an inner meaning.
Yeah, he's saying these key words always have a sort of multifaceted approach that assumes the existence of this kind of rich spiritual world and realities, unseen realities that are part of the everyday world.
Can you, from your other reading of Barfield, can you think of an example of that, of some ancient
Well,
work that...
I mean, one of the obvious ones is that gets used because it's in, it's well known in scriptures, is pneuma, right? Which means air, means breath, and it means wind and spirit. So it's like, it's all those things as once. So like there's the famous verse in, I think it's the early chapters of John where, Jesus talked about needing, the spirit goes where, and it talks, it's people, if you, as reading in English, you think Jesus is making a metaphor about spirit and wind, like saying, oh yeah, the spirit's like the wind, it blows wherever it goes, and but it's actually the same word, pneuma, that's used both ways.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same exact word. There's not a metaphor being made between these two things that were different words that Jesus is using. The idea was bound up already in that word utilization there.
And so when the translators are translating it, they're trying to make it make sense for someone who's an English speaker, because we
right. So they have to use a different word for
divided the word.
Yeah. And this is something Barfield, he harps on over and over again. Just because you make a distinction for something mentally, conceptually, doesn't make it, doesn't necessarily mean you've sundered it in reality. I mean, you've sundered your ability to see them as united temporarily in making the distinction, but that doesn't necessarily get rid of this whole that is still there. And I think that's one of the things, we've been doing for such a long time, and there's so many layers into which we've made these conceptual distinctions and categories that we don't. There's many aspects of a sort of holistic perspective of the world that's very difficult for us to entertain. I know it is for me. Even in reading Barfield is very difficult for me, just because I'm like, I always get to these points where I'm like, what is he talking about here? Like, because I still think in a very mechanistic, mechanical parts mode. That's how I understand things. And he's trying to point to something that supersedes all that.
Well, this example of pneuma is particularly timely, I think, because with the whole COVID thing, I mean, part of the way I've been praying for people when I've known that someone had COVID is just that we know that the Lord is as close to us as breathing, and that he gives us every breath. And so, can you be with that person and, be in every breath that they have? Well, when we think that way about breath, we're obviously thinking about spirit, right? So, and it's the breath that gives us life. And so we're very conscious of this whole issue of breathing now, because with COVID, that's what it affects the most, is this ability to breathe. And that's just what sustains life. So the wind one is a little bit trickier to understand how that all gets wrapped up into one word, but that may be because of the early spiritual perspective that they had on storms and winds and things like that. I mean, the wind would have been, in some sense, it could be a very nurturing thing, because the wind will bring in the rain, or the wind will bring in a fresh breeze on a hot day. Mm-hmm. So the wind can be restorative, but at the same time can be very judgmental, crushing.
And it is how you become aware of where that well, in a sense, most of the time you're not aware of air, because you see through it all the time. Mm-hmm. It's translucent. So the wind becomes this manifestation where suddenly what was invisible takes on a visible manifestation via its interaction with what you can see.
Mm-hmm. And they could have thought of it, the early people could have thought of it as some kind of manifestation of God's power. Right? So all those words in the beginning, breath, spirit, wind, and what's the other one? You said there were 4.
Air.
Oh, air. Yeah, could have all been in their minds, like, this is a manifestation of God's power, pneuma. It's funny, we do use the word to express a certain kind of power, like pneumatic. Mm-hmm. Right? Yeah.
It's again, for me, it's so difficult for me to try and put myself back in those shoes of like how the world must have been experienced. And I don't know, like in a lot of ways I think to moderns, it feels very simplistic. But I think not necessarily so, because, and we've talked about this before, because as soon as you personify a phenomenon, this is back to that spirit of finesse versus spirit of geometry. You suddenly become, you actually see more of a thing, not less. When it's, when you see that there's a sort of intelligence, a sort of agency at work, you actually can see more of what's going on, and you see a complexity. Whereas when you use the machine metaphor, you almost necessarily reduce the thing to its parts. And this part does X, this part does Y, and you kind of constrict your thinking into a sort of a linear, step-by-step sort of mechanics. But very, very difficult to do that. And even looking at like the simplest cell, if you try to understand it in just a linear way, like you really aren't understanding it, because there's this whole complexity of what's going on there. And of course, we struggle with this all the time, because we want to have mastery and control of things, and to do that, we think in a linear structure of like, okay, there's chemical problem X in a person's cell, so if we give them this this medicine or this pharmaceutical product, it's going to produce this thing in it, and that'll fix the problem. Yay, we win. And of course, it's so much more complex than that. It may fix that problem and cause 10 other problems of a worse variety, or it may fix it in the near term but cause like some reaction in the cell that builds up over time that makes it worse. Like there's a million things going on there that are, you're better off personifying the cell and think, well, what does the cell want? What is it trying to do? What are the things it's afraid of? What are the things it wants? And it, like those are actually maybe going to give you more insights than this purely linear, like, oh, this is the machine does X.
That's probably why they use that language, like when they're talking about bees or something, they say the bees decided to do something, because that helps them think about the problems that they're trying to solve in terms of why things are done a certain way. But
yeah,
but I'm also thinking about, if we translate this over into like the mathematical realm, I heard this female physicist talking about in her quest to connect the largest structures of the universe to the smallest structures of the universe necessitates the use of a lot of math and kind of experimenting with math. And she said that she'll get a certain amount of, she'll start working with formulas and doing problems, and then she'll get all these structures that come out, mathematical structures. And then she said it's a matter of looking at them and finding the patterns, right? She's not looking at it mechanistically. She's looking for patterns, because the patterns tell her how to navigate her way through all this math. And I think that's kind of the same thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
You're sort of personifying, you're taking the mathematics and giving it a shape.
Yeah, and it's this weird thing again, where it's again, I see the icon idol in here, where it's like you necessarily have to kind of oversimplify things to some extent. Otherwise, you just become overwhelmed, and you can't be playful, right? You can't move things around until you've broken them down into some sort of oversimplified story. But at the same time, you have to have this sort of sense of something larger. And I think, like pattern is a word, I think, that gets used. It could be used in both ways, right? It can be the icon, or it can be the idol, because it can be, because I think when you're doing a good way of doing pattern matching, where it actually has these amazing effects, and mathematicians talk about this all the time, is they always look for a certain elegance or beauty in what they're doing, and some that almost always seems to kind of point the way when they're trying to feel their way through all the different possibilities. Oftentimes this sort of sense. I was rewatching there was one of Paul's early conversations was the guy that was like a math PhD, and he was really enamored with Euclid, and was just and how amazing Euclid's work was, and how like most mathematicians today don't even read Euclid. He's like, and he's like, I would rather listen to Mozart do Mozart than listen to like a 10-year-old bang out Mozart on a MIDI keyboard, he's like effectively what our math textbooks do today. He's like, for him, like math is like this place where he experiences beauty and awe and all these things. And he's like, going back to the original source, he can see that that's how they were looking at and interacting with it as well. Whereas we often want to kind of boil things down to this sort of, like his analogy, it's like Mozart on the MIDI keyboard with like, it's just making a one tone sound for each little note. And it's, yeah, is that the same Mozart symphony? Yes. And no, not really. It's so I think that this sort of depth is always at play when we're doing things well. One of the things I've when I was younger, I used to like to play chess, and one of the simplest ways to know whether you're making a good move in chess versus a bad move is, are you accomplishing like 4 or 5 things simultaneously with the move? That's an easy way, because I'm always looking for easy ways and shortcuts to understand something. That's an easy way to know you made a good move. And the way you win at chess is you start forcing your opponent to make moves where they're only achieving one thing at a time. Like they're having to make a move simply because you've boxed them into a corner, and they can only protect their king or do something like that. And as soon as that starts occurring, you win the game. And so so what I was talking about before with pattern, like if you need a pattern that is rich enough that it's iconically lensing multiple levels of reality simultaneously. And I don't think we actually know that we're doing that, but I think when we personify the world, we naturally do it. We look for that depth. We look for things to line up in ways intuitively that we don't do otherwise. When we're just in this sort of machine element of like, okay, I just got to get all the things to line up and now I'm done. And I've solved it. It's a completely different mode of being. And there's again a sense of being sort of overwhelmed. You're kind of at the limits of what you feel like you can take on in terms of complexity. And again, there's that sense of there's something outside yourself that is sort of influencing and kind of pointing the finger at where you take the next step and how you move things along. And some of your capacity or ability to continue the process patiently, lovingly, diligently is a sort of faith that next step is going to be there if you keep feeling for it, which is why I think people can become so enamored with something like math, even though it's people are like, well, I don't get it. And, it's just this procedural thing you're doing, but it's not that. It's about this deep and inner web of relationships that allows you to get in touch with sort of fundamental components of not just the outer world, even, or math, or not just like even physics and all that, but even just the inner ways in which you are formed and shaped.
Well, that fits in. I mean, the way you describe it is so clearly like my art process, but it also makes me think about, again, this video I was watching about symmetry. And this is where it fits in with the Barfield thing, because I had marked in big letters on page, what page was that? Doesn't really matter, I guess. Oh, page 29, the word proportion. He says it becomes apparent on reflection that the speaker's meaning and the lexical meaning are at the same time examples of different proportions in their relationships. Anyway, this idea of proportion and the idea of symmetry, one of the things that they brought up in this video is that we do see symmetry all around us, in the petals on a flower, in a butterfly that opens up and it has this, I forget what kind of symmetry they call that, where it's facing symmetry. The symmetry of a person's face. Mm-hmm. But all of these things, there's a slight imperfection, because if you take a person's face down the middle and reproduce one half on the other half, so you have a perfectly symmetrical face, doesn't even look like the person.
Yeah.
And all the petals on a flower, it's repetition, but as you've said many times in the past, it's a non-identical repetition. But it does give the appearance of symmetry, but it looks beautiful because of the slight imperfections. It's not, if you have a flower that's exactly perfect symmetry, it's just going to look like a fake, right? So we recognize when something is real because there is a slight imperfection in it. And I think that the amount of imperfection is a matter of proportion. And the proportion has to be that you have a whole lot of symmetry and a little bit of imperfection. Because if you have too much imperfection, then you get so much randomness that you start to lose the integrity of the object. So I think that proportion is another one of those things that's kind of a fundamental drive your stake in the ground of all the meaning in the universe. You know, there's boundaries, there's proportion. And so in this chapter, he's talking about the proportion between how much of what we say is the speaker's meaning and how much of it is the lexical meaning. That's a matter of sliding proportion always when you're talking and thinking. And then when you're thinking back through, like when he talks about the dimensions of language, you have the speaker's meaning and the lexical meaning. And under the speaker's meaning, you have the speaker's history, their own personal history. And then you also have the environment of the now in which that speaker resides, their own capacity for everything that's in that person now, as well as their history. And over on the lexical meaning side, you have the dimension of time going all the way back to the beginning of language. And then the genesis and the history of each word and the words and how they fit together. Even the syntax and everything has this time dimension to it because grammar has changed. I mean, all you have to do is go back and try to read Chaucer. So, and he's, you know, he says the true nature of language can't be grasped if you exclude the time dimension, which of course is what he's talking about with the history there.
Yeah. Well, something you said there, like sparked, sometime this week, I stumbled across a book that was called The Strangeness of the Good, which reminded me of something, again, another sort of heuristic or shortcut I use, that there's just something about, for instance, like when I'm listening to somebody talk, and I'm trying to figure out, I guess one of the elements I would use this for is to see if someone's telling the truth or not, in a certain sense, like speaking from themselves, because there's a certain, I don't know, a certain strangeness, a certain, like, and when I say that, what am I saying? I'm saying like a sort of irreducible complexity that comes across when people are speaking, especially when they're telling their own story. And to me, it's like I don't know, it just screams out at me. It's a sort of like marker of the truth, or like a marker of, I don't know, but I do think when you were talking about this non-identical repetition, it seems like that's in some sense what the logos of being is always trying to achieve. Is it's more of this. It's like a full further blossoming of it is, in some sense, it is the same pattern, but it is a new wrinkle in it. Like all these new sort of variations and playful adaptions of what was in a startling and new way. And I think that's one of the why fairy tales are such a great, there's something so great about them in terms of trying to help us to see and understand that this sort of strangeness, this sort of weirdness is actually all around us. There's something, I think, that, but by kind of thrusting us into this sort of magical mode of perceiving it, and in the stories that fairy tales tend to showcase, that I don't know, I feel like it's incredibly helpful for producing that kind of mindset to see the world around us as much more alive with intent than we tend to do, in a postmodern 21st century.
Sure. I mean, one of the ways that he was describing the symmetry, the imperfections in the symmetry, is thinking of something like a snowflake, but there were many, many examples, but snowflake is just one of them. Snowflake is a hexagon and there's 6 parts and each part is identical, almost, right? If you only had 1/6 of a snowflake, you could recreate that snowflake. You'd know what the rest of the snowflake looked like, more or less. But so in that way, it's a data compression, very interesting data compression, because you don't have to know everything about a snowflake in order to know the form of a snowflake. And if you had 1 petal of a flower and how many petals there were, and what the formula is for how the petals fit into the center, you could recreate the flower. It was just 1 petal, but it's not going to be the beautiful flower because it doesn't have the imperfections. But
Yeah.
still, you've got that data compression at work. And
It's so interesting, like, and like, even like with something like a snowflake, which is, you know, it's not a living cell or anything, but how does that symmetry occur? You know, why doesn't it look, you know, if it's a quote unquote random process, why doesn't it follow completely different parameters over on side B as it accumulates the moisture in this frozen matter, you know, of the water? Like, why does it, what holds together this remarkable symmetry? And this all, you know, this at the same time with this continual, almost endless variation. It's remarkable.
yeah, they'd probably say it has something to do with minimizing energy loss, but I don't know. I mean, you make a good point. Even if there is something that explains why it comes out with the symmetry, how does it develop that symmetry in situations where there's different environment surrounding?
Because I've always heard with
different
snowflakes
aspects of
that like they think that the variability is like each snowflake starts with like a seed of some kind, and that
Mhm.
seed might be something like this fragment of dust or something, like, or some sort of fragment of something in the air that starts the process of the snowflake forming. But then I'm curious, you know, still I have the question, okay, so that's the initial conditions, but what keeps it as it spreads out and goes in all these different directions to form the 6-sided structure you're referring to? What causes it to take the identical path over on this arm and that arm and that arm and that arm that it took over here, so that it all comes together in the end? It's interesting.
Yeah, and they're so beautiful. You have to think that, I mean, I just think they're little gifts, you know. I just think they're little gifts. One of the pictures that he draws in here that I really like was when he says that Emerson was one of those who pointed out that this process, I should tell you what the process is. First of all, the process of language changing is the history of a cliche is not necessarily at an end. It may come to be used so often that it ceases to be even conventionally figurative. It may reach a stage where there is no longer any translucence, in other words, an ability to see through it into something else, or even pretended or half remembered translucence of one concomitant meaning through another, so that what began long ago by being a new and indistinguishable inner or immaterial meaning of a phrase or word will have become its only meaning. We have already seen how meanings are contracted by speakers simply dropping part of them altogether. That made me think of George Orwell and his essay on language and writing, and why you should be very careful of using cliches. You can use a cliche that's completely dead, because then it has some sort of actual meaning in the language. Or you can use a cliche you can use a turn of phrase that's completely alive, but you don't want to use one that's somewhere in the middle between the two, because those cliches have lost all their power. Anyway, then he says Emerson was one of those who pointed out that this was the process by which the greater part of our modern vocabulary has been produced. And here's the picture. As the limestone of the continent consists of infinite masses of the shells of animalcules, so language is made up of images or tropes, which now in their secondary use have long ceased to remind us of their poetic origin. Have you ever seen that picture of this cliffs of Dover? The White Cliffs of Dover, they're made up of all these animalcules, these little carcasses.
Oh, yeah.
They have photographs of that, and you can see all these little tiny.
I've not seen the zoom in. I've seen the distance of the White Cliffs, but I've not seen the zoomed in.
I'll see if I can find one because it's quite amazing. I'll link one in the description. So was there anything else you wanted to bring up from this chapter? You want to give some examples of material and immaterial? He uses quite a few examples in here of words that have both a material and immaterial. Just for people.
Yeah, well, he uses heart as an obvious example where we still use it in both ways. While you were talking about like cliches, for some reason, what popped into my mind was the phrase "by the way,"
Oh.
which was funny. I don't know. I think I was hearing. It was Paul was this is like a couple of years ago or something. He was reading something by C.S. Lewis, and C.S. Lewis, the way he used that phrase in a certain sense made me suddenly realize, oh, that's "by the way" is talking about a reference to being on a path, the way, and it's by the way. So it's off the track. You're taking it, your reference that you're taking a we're getting off the way we're going, and we're on this other side path now. But like, I've been using that my whole life and never had noticed that you just say "by the way," like you're like, it's such a dead thing. And I would imagine people even younger than myself who haven't read books from C.S. Lewis and the 19th and 18th centuries, they probably even have less of an idea that was used in a more imagistic way. Like when I say "by the way," I have no imagistic thing. I just know I've heard it used that way a million times, of just like a kind of interjection between what I'm saying now, and you're kind of announcing. In some sense, I probably had intuited the sense that like you would introduce it, use as an introduction for something that's a kind of off topic, right?
Yeah.
But like I didn't. Other than that, I had
useful. It's a very useful phrase, right? And it's not distracting in the sense that some half-dead cliches are distracting because you just want to groan when you hear it, right? By the way is such a dead cliche.
Yeah. Well, it was funny is the way kids use it nowadays is it's BT dubs.
Yeah.
Which is just like, because like they're so often texting like BTW.
Well, I mean, I often text BTW, but to text BT dubs would take longer.
But that's how you would say it out loud.
Oh, that's how you say it. Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, but what's funny is like the way, because texting is so much a part of people's lives, people will say things out loud that are representative of what they said in text. Like lulls or like BT dubs. I can't even think of examples because I'm not from that. I don't know. I'm not really in that age group, I guess, but I'm a little bit cognizant of it, and which is funny, like how much people's sense of words is being impacted or shaped by those the use of language. I've noticed, man, my spelling gets worse and worse as I age because I spend so much time on computers, and I don't have to know how to spell anything. You just like badly type something into Google and it knows what you meant anyway.
Yeah, and that's going to affect things going forward, I'm sure. So one last thing before we quit, do you want to say anything about T.S. Eliot and the objective correlative?
That's where he's talking about the objective and I can't even speak, correlative is he is kind of the I guess what, like, it's kind of the fodder that a poet uses to try and convey. So this is, I would say that this is sort of a modern kind of thinking for what a poet is doing. what a poet is trying to get at is these sort of inner realities, right? That are, I think, more than ever kind of mysterious and removed. And so like, but the objective correlative is trying to find fragments of images that have this sort of substance in the material world that we can see and touch and taste and smell, et cetera, that can somehow lens and point into these mysterious experiences we have in consciousness, that we are, again, in the materials frame, we've had such a sort of low regard for consciousness, right? And even now, like with like, you know, like in our last conversation talking about Max Tegmark, he kind of postulates, so yeah, we're going to find a way to mathematically describe consciousness anytime soon now, and we're just about there. There's this sort of I don't know, it's like we've taught people to sort of distrust the phenomenological experiences of consciousness as being only quote unquote subjective, and therefore kind of you throw them in the trash bin and you pound into your head instead what you know from objective quote unquote facts. You go after those and you fill your head with those, and whatever this subjective mumbo jumbo is, you throw it in the trash. And it seems like the poet's almost trying to do the opposite. It's trying to say, okay, it's trying to kind of re-engineer a path back into validating these sort of subjective conscious experiences as being formative of the world.
Yeah. And so sometimes a poet or an artist might even take an image of an old cracked concrete wall, which most people would walk right by and just think is trash. And then they'll use that as a way into some spiritual metaphor or something. Yep. Anyway, he says in here that this idea of the objective correlative, the way that T.S. Eliot used it, is very similar to the way in which the lexical meaning expands through the, you know, the particular instance of the operation of speakers on lexical meaning, which I classified as expansion. So how the speakers and lexical meaning work together to create the expansion of the meaning of a word.
Yeah. And just for clarification, speaker's meaning is Barfield's designation for what I specifically am hoping to communicate when I choose a particular word, which may closely model the way that word would appear in a dictionary, which would be its lexical version, or it may deviate substantially, right? I may again be trying to use that word in a very different mode of being, but it's the best thing I got right now to introduce in the conversation. Or maybe, you know, I don't have a rich vocabulary, and so it's the word that's available to me to choose. But so there's always this gap in terms of the richness of what we want to say and the lexical meanings of the words we have available to us.
That's the interesting thing about language, isn't it? Is how much redundancy is built into it. Because I notice as I get older that I'm often searching for a particular word and it just won't come to me. But if I just relax and don't try to find that particular word, 5 other words that are perfectly suitable for that spot will show up in my head. So
yeah, that's such a great thing. And what happens to me is oftentimes I'll get stuck being like, no, I want to find that one word that I can't think of right now. And then like the whole process comes to an end. I'm like just sitting there doing nothing. Because it's like you once you've hit your head against that wall, it's like there's nothing you can really do to get past it. Like you're like, I know the word starts with an S or something like that, but that's about as far as I can get most of the time until, you know, a day later or something like that. I'm like, that was the word I was trying to think of.
Well, the challenging part of it is if you have exactly the right word, you can be much more precise in your speech and you have to use fewer words and it's more effective, more elegant way of phrasing it. If you're using a word that's slightly off, you have to go into more detail and, you know, be a little bit more verbose, which is what happens to me because I'm often not finding the precise word.
Yeah. But I think sometimes the words can also be used like there's lots of throwaway words that we use as a way, sort of euphemisms to distance ourselves from the thing. Like, on the Voxer thread I'm a part of, Sherry shared something from George Carlin where he was actually speaking to like the National Press Club or something in Washington. And he was talking about, he was making the observation about how, like, what we call post-traumatic stress syndrome today used to be called shell shock. And he went through different iterations for how we ended up. And he was saying that each iteration, we had like increasing syllables, but also increasing distance from the sort of phenomenological reality of what was happening. That allows the speaker to say it with some distance from the thing they're saying. And I think there's definitely something sort of not mischievous, but like something devious in that does again, what it allows us to do is it allows us to have a pretense at an objective point of view, because we're saying, oh, like, I'm not emotionally connected to this at all. I'm standing over here unmoved, and I have a quote unquote objective view of the whole thing, and I can speak authoritatively as an expert, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That I think is there's a time and a place for it, but it's just infected, especially in this talk. He's saying how it's especially infected political rhetoric.
I think you would enjoy reading Richard Mitchell with all the stuff that you've read of Barfield. I think you would enjoy.
I'm not familiar with him.
He was a guy, he used to write a column. Maybe he was an author and then wrote a column, or he wrote the column and then turned it into these books. But one of the books is called Less Than Words Can Say. Brilliant. The other one is Graves of Academe, and they're both so prescient, because those are the things that are being talked about today. The death of the academy. He started talking about how he could see it coming because he saw the kind of language that was being introduced into the academy. And then Less Than Words Can Say, he starts out by talking about how language has gotten so devolved due to our tendency to want to put everything into a grant application. What kind of scientific mumbo jumbo do I have to use in order to bring something to a point where I can apply for a grant so I can get federal money or academic money or something in order to study this particular thing? And post-traumatic stress disorder occurs to me that that's one of those phrases that over time came to that place, because you can get grant money if you're studying post-traumatic stress disorder, but you can't get grant money if you're studying shell shock because you don't have any personal experience with it, right?
Yeah.
But post-traumatic stress disorder can be dissected and partitioned and looked at through a microscope, and study the brain and all of that kind of thing. So yeah, I think you'd like Less Than Words Can Say, especially. And he has a brilliant part in there from one of Winston Churchill's speeches that basically that got Britain motivated to get out there and help win the Second World War. And then he translates it into this other kind of language. And I mean, it's hilarious.
I'll have to check him out. That sounds really up my alley.
Yeah. Well, this has been great, Michael. I will read through chapter 3 times because it's going to take me that long to figure it out.
Barfield usually becomes, as his books progress, they become harder because he assumes what he's relayed previously. And sometimes you kind of do and you kind of don't. And then he builds another layer on top of it. And now you're like, wait a minute. So
so I have to keep going back. I have to go back to chapter 1 now. What was it? Because you kind of get it and then it sort of evaporates,
It's very contrary to the consciousness we all inhabit and have to understand to be kind of cultural inhabitants of the 21st century. So it's work to translate.
It'd be interesting to see how was it how he grew up, or what made him have the capacity to be able to think inside that universe,
Yeah, he does talk in one of his first books about how because he was kind of an atheist, coming out of World War One. And it was experiences with poetry that he said, you know, he phenomenologically could not deny that something sort of mysterious was going on there. And that's kind of what sparked his journey. Which again was incredibly influential. People often talk about, you know, C.S. Lewis's conversion and the influence Tolkien had on him, but I think if you read through the Great War series of letters that were exchanged over like a 10-year period with C.S. Lewis prior to his conversion, I think Barfield's ability to convince C.S. Lewis that the past had all this treasure built into it, and to reveal to C.S. Lewis that he had what he called chronological snobbery. What was new is necessarily better was a huge component of Lewis, you know, being suddenly open to look at as Christianity being the myth that had come true.
Say no to chronological snobbery. Join the Barfield bandwagon. Good talking to you, Michael. Have a great week.
Yeah, same here. You too.
Bye-bye.